hypothesis. Okay, Assalamualaikum. Now let's look at what hypothesis is, which is the following lesson in your book. Now, according to your book, hypothesis is a tentative statement of assumption of a relationship between two variables. Okay, it is an assumption. And then it is an assumption, a systematic assumption. It should be formulated after you have a clear problem statement and the research objective have been identified. Okay, it can be simply written as, if something happens, then this will happen. Now, this is a bit too general because there are different types of hypotheses, being the, where are they again? We have an experimental hypothesis and a relationship hypothesis. This is somewhat related to what we've learned previously. So it says, depending on the problem statement and the research objective, okay, the types of hypothesis that will be used or that will be formulated will differ. So if the aim is to derive a cause and effect explanation, which is the experimental research study, then the researcher will formulate an experimental hypothesis. Okay, however, if you aim to examine relationship or correlation between variables, okay, then you will formulate a relationship hypothesis. Okay, so finally, a researcher must make sure that the hypothesis is testable. Okay, so let's look at experimental and relationship hypothesis in detail. We'll start off with experimental hypothesis first. Okay, by right, it means that it is testing the difference between manipulations, things that manipulate, right? Especially in experimental research study, where we have the independent variable and the dependent variables. So if you remember, in this experiment, the types of shoes manipulates the speed of running. Okay, so for this type of research, you would use an experimental hypothesis. Okay, so the hypothesis should indicate an assumption of cause. And by the way, your book gives a different example, okay, or provide a different example. You can read them on your own. I'm using a different example because it's easier for me to explain my example, but you can read it on your own and try to understand what it means within the definition. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so the hypothesis should indicate as an assumption of cause and effect. So in an experimental hypothesis, usually you use the phrase, there will be a difference between. Okay, let's go back to the experiment. So remember, this experiment is about the effects of the types of shoes on the speed of running. So okay, using what we had talked about just now, there will be a difference. So the hypothesis will be, there will be a difference between the types of shoes worn and the speed of running. Okay, there will be a difference between the speed of running while wearing different types of shoes. Okay, so on the other hand, or in your book it says, on the contrary, a relationship hypothesis is not in any way testing differences. Right? We're not testing differences. We look at the relationship between the two variables. Okay, remember the relationship variables, the relationship between the predictor and the outcome variables. Alright, okay, again in your book, okay, it provides an example, a different example. Can you read them on your own? But I like to use my own example because it's easier for me to explain. It's easy for me to explain. Right. So usually in a relationship hypothesis, you use the phrase "there will be a relationship." Okay. So if you remember, the relationship between violent video games and the scores in aggression questionnaire. So the hypothesis, that the relationship hypothesis that we can formulate is there will be a relationship between those who played violent video games and their score in aggression questionnaires. Okay. Just to reiterate what was mentioned in your book, it says in the final paragraph of the note on experimental hypothesis, experimental and what was that again? The relationship hypothesis. It says that with a clear problem statement and research objective, you will know whether to formulate experimental or relationship hypothesis. Okay, a clear problem statement and hypothesis are by right a result of thorough reading of past literature. So literature review and reading a lot of journal article that is related to your research is very important. Okay, because through reading of past literature or existing research evidences, a researcher will be able to determine research gaps. So when the research gaps is identified, it will enable a researcher to decide whether it's important to derive a causal explanation, okay, or a relationship explanation. Thank you very much.